is the narrated PowerPoint for John Stuart Mill. Just as a reminder, there's also a record of the conversation that we had in our Zoom meetings this week, also regarding John Stuart Mill. The first one focuses on utilitarianism, and the second one focuses on John Stuart Mill's writing on Liberty. A little bit of background about John Stuart Mill. He was actually kind of a cool guy. He was born in 1806, and he was one of the early people who advocated in favor of gender equality. All of this will come into play as sort of examples of his political philosophy as we go a little bit further in. But he married a woman named Harriet. Apparently, he loved her super a lot and believed in women's equality in ways that were ahead of their time for 1800s Great Britain, when women didn't have a lot of rights. He was also an advocate of modified universal suffrage. I say modified universal suffrage. He was actually a little bit of an elitist from today's standards. He thought that better educated people should probably have more votes than less educated people. But he believed in the value of giving people a say in how their government is run. He believed that that was valuable for society. He was also an advocate of liberty, which you saw if you read the book On Liberty, or the selections from On Liberty that I signed for you. The difference between Mill and somebody like Locke, though, is that for Mill, liberty is utilitarian. Liberty is important because of the purpose it serves, right? So Mill's political philosophy is not based on the same sort of rights-based concept that Locke's political philosophy is based on. It's a different take on the value of liberty. John Stuart Mill comes from the ethical philosophical school of thought called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a political philosophy that says that whenever we're trying to decide what to do, either as individuals or as a government, our goal should be to make choices that will bring the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of people, or the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. And that's basically what utilitarian political philosophy says. So I want to talk a little bit about utilitarianism. Primarily, this isn't a be-all, end-all. You don't need to ever learn anything more about utilitarianism. I just kind of want to give you an idea of what utilitarianism is, and some of the criticisms that have been leveled against it, and a little bit about how some utilitarians have answered those criticisms. So the basic idea of utilitarianism is that actions are the right thing to do if they will tend to lead to greater levels of pleasure or happiness, and they're the wrong thing to do if they produce pain, or if they produce less happiness or more unhappiness to the greater number of people. John Stuart Mill said in a book that he wrote called Utilitarianism, pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. All desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. In some ways, he's reflecting a little bit the idea that Hobbes brought up, which is that human nature drives people to try to acquire things that they find pleasurable and to move away from things that they find painful. Utilitarianism sort of takes this idea and runs with it. And what the utilitarians argue is that if you boil down people's policy preferences or people's preferences about how they structure their lives, if you boil it down to their basic components, it'll all boil down to pleasure and freedom from pain. So that's why utilitarians say that pleasure and avoiding pain are the only things that are useful in and of themselves without some other purpose. Everything is a means to that end, and pleasure and pain are the only ends that people ultimately move toward. It's an egalitarian theory in the sense that utilitarians generally argue that everybody's pleasure counts equally. This is something that might fit with modern political theory more than it probably would have fit in back in the days that John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians who came before him, like Jeremy Bentham, would have experienced in their life. If you think about how society was structured back in England, some people's pleasure was decidedly more important than others, right? Wealthy people who hired servants didn't or weren't required to treat those servants very well. The assumption was that those servants were there to serve their betters, quote unquote. Same thing if you look at what happened in a lot of the factories where the workers were not treated particularly well. There was a lot of child labor. There were no guarantees of safety within the workplace. This is also around the time when utilitarianism had its, when John Stuart Mill was writing, was also the time when people were starting to explore concepts put forth by Marx and Engels with regard to communism. So it kind of goes, they're contemporary ideas in that sense. Utilitarianism is not a rights-based theory. While Mill comes down in favor of protecting people's liberty as if they were rights, the theory is actually based on the consequences of the actions that we take. And so for Mill, the reason people's rights, the reason we should agree that some things should be elevated in protection as rights is because when we do that, the outcome tends to be better than if we allow people to be restricted in certain ways. So Locke argues that we have natural rights, life, liberty, property, and that governments should not be allowed to violate those rights except under very limited circumstances. Mill and other utilitarians argue that there is no such thing as natural rights, and the government is not obligated to never, for example, take anybody's property away or restrict free speech or anything like that. What Mill and other utilitarians argue is that most of the time, society is better off if people's liberties are protected as if they were natural rights, even though utilitarians don't believe that they're natural rights. Hope that makes sense. Utilitarianism is also a consequential type of political theory. Actions are judged, choices are judged based on the outcome that would result from taking that action, whereas a rights-based perspective makes the argument that if people have rights, then it doesn't really matter what might happen if you trample on those rights. The rights are there and they need to be respected. If you think about what's going on right now with the protests over closures, economic closures and stay-at-home orders and stuff, from a utilitarian perspective, whether those stay-at-home orders are the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do really doesn't have anything to do with whether people have a right to go outside their homes or a right to pursue economic prosperity or a right to go around without a mask on if they want to do that. From a utilitarian perspective, the question would be which choice, keeping the government shut down or opening the government back up, right? Keeping the economy, shut down, or opening up the economy. Which one of those choices in this time would generally be expected to lead to the best possible outcome for the most people? And then a utilitarianism would say you should be basing government, your decisions about when to open up the economy based on what you think in your best estimate is going to bring the greatest amount of happiness or the least amount of pain, regardless of whether somebody has a right to something or not. So for utilitarian, the right consequence is always that which maximizes the good and minimizes the bad. So utilitarianism has been around for a really long time, but because it's been around for a really long time, it's come into its fair share of criticism. And I just want to go over quickly 4 criticisms of utilitarianism. This dovetails with to a certain extent, the videos that I asked you to watch about utilitarianism. So I might add a few little things, but this should parallel that pretty closely. The first criticism is that utilitarianism is hedonistic. Some people have called it a pig philosophy, that as long as the pig is happy in the slop, you don't ask anything more of the pig. And the question is, don't we want to ask more of people than just that they should pursue pleasure and avoid pain? Isn't there more to life than that? What Mill does is he adds a sort of qualitative dimension to the idea of happiness or pleasure and pain. He says Mill argues that there are higher and lower orders of happiness, and government should be promoting, and our education systems should be promoting, and parents should be promoting, etc., the cultivation of those higher levels of happiness. And he says that the higher pleasures should count more than the lower pleasures. So if you're going to be making a decision about whether a government should fund the symphony or fund dogfighting rings or something like that, it doesn't matter to Mill necessarily that there might be more people who want to go to a dogfight. Don't go to a dogfight. Dogfights are horrible. Mill might argue that you should still promote the symphony because the symphony is a higher order pleasure. And Mill argues that rational people who are well educated and who use their brains will find greater happiness in higher order pleasures. Now, I said at the very beginning of this discussion that Mill was a little bit of an elitist, so this is where Mill's argument kind of comes out. And he makes the argument that only people who have experienced higher order pleasures and lower order pleasures can accurately gauge which one is a higher order pleasure. So somebody who's never been to the symphony, according to Mill, is in no position to judge whether the symphony is more pleasurable than listening to a garage band or something like that. Like I said, Mill was a bit of an elitist. So Mill argues that Mill argues that it's not hedonistic in the sense that all pleasure is equally acceptable and that we should equally promote all kinds of pleasures. But he does make the argument that it's okay for society to sort of preference some pleasures over others, even though he doesn't back away from the idea that at its heart, utilitarianism is about maximizing happiness and minimizing unhappiness. The second argument against utilitarianism is that it's really time consuming. When you're trying to make decisions about what you should do, what kind of job you should pursue, should you take this job or that job, if two jobs are offered to you, should the government fund this program or that program, critics of utilitarianism argue that it takes a long time to make these kinds of calculations, and sometimes you just don't have a ton of leisure time available to make decisions about adding up the pleasure and adding up the pain before you make every decision. Mill argues that there are actually some decisions that can be easily made if we use what he calls subordinate rules, or what we call common sense morality, to help guide our decisions. So this is a little bit of a departure from strict utilitarianism. It's sometimes referred to as rule utilitarianism, that society already knows what sorts of things generally result in greater happiness and less pain. And we don't have to recalculate every single time we make a decision if we just sort of keep these subordinate rules or common sense morality in mind. It can really cut down on the time and effort that it takes to know what decision would be the best for the most people. So common sense morality would include things like don't kill. Generally speaking, not killing people is a better outcome than killing people. It's going to lead to a better outcome. So if your decision is about whether you should kill somebody or not kill somebody, you don't really have to make a calculus. Don't cheat, don't steal, keep your promises, right? That's very Hobbesian, keep your promises. Don't obey the law in general. Mill says that you probably are going to be better off in your life if you don't break the law. because then you won't be punished, hopefully, for doing something that could get you in trouble. These things can generally be assumed to lead to the greater good most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time, according to Mill. So that it's not as time consuming as it might seem, because we don't always have to start from zero when we make decisions about things. We can use this sort of common sense morality to help guide behavior, either as a government or as individuals, without having to spend all of our time, with an Excel spreadsheet trying to figure out a cost-benefit analysis. The third objection to utilitarianism is that we can't possibly know the consequences of every choice. So when we're trying to figure out which decision will come up with the best outcome, critics of utilitarianism argue that there's just no way to know. Sometimes there's unforeseen circumstances. Things that we're talking about now. Should we move to mail-in voting so that people don't have to go to polling places in November when the coronavirus might still be wreaking havoc in our country? Well, we don't know how much necessarily, we don't know for mathematical certainty whether mail-in voting will lead to fraud. The question will be, of course, would we be better off with whatever level of fraud we think there's going to be if the result is that more people can vote and less people get sick, et cetera? We actually know that there's not that much voter fraud as a result of mail-in voting, but there might be some processes that we want to put in place. We can't possibly know the actual consequences, so we have to make our best guess decisions. Should states reopen to get the economy going? Well, we don't really know for certain sure exactly how many people will get sick if we open up the economy in this way or this way or this way. And so this is a potential objection to utilitarianism. Utilitarians would respond to this is that we're not stupid. We're not completely without any information at all. And so what utilitarianism asks us to do is just say, look, take the best evidence you can, listen to the best experts you can come up with, and make decisions based on rationality and probabilities and what's happened in the past, et cetera. So, for example, we know that there's not a lot of concrete, hard and fast evidence of widespread voter fraud in states that use mail-in voting. So Oregon uses mail-in voting. California has expanded its mail-in voting. Most states have some form of mail-in voting, and there just isn't a lot of evidence. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of anecdotal, well, I heard from somebody that they saw voter fraud. But we can rationally look at what's already going on with voter fraud. We also already know what's happened in some areas of the world when they have started reopening their economies. We know, we can look at, okay, what happened when this country relaxed its standards, or we'll see soon in the states that are beginning to open their economy more quickly than other states, whether that turns out to be a good idea or a bad idea. If it turns out to be a really good idea, then states can say, okay, look, maybe we were more scared than we needed to be. And this kind of reopening of the economy with limited access to restaurants where you can only fill your restaurant to 25% capacity, if that doesn't lead to a spike in sickness or death, then maybe it's okay to do that, right? So utilitarians argue that we already know a lot of stuff that we can use to apply to a new situation. We don't have to start from scratch. Probably the most common and serious objection to utilitarianism is that it allows people's rights to be sacrificed in the name of the greater good. And rights-based theorists would argue that it's wrong to harm individuals, even if doing so would make lots of people happy. So I think the example given in one of the videos is something along the lines of if somebody who's in prison can be a match for a bunch of different people who are waiting for donors for body parts, et cetera, that from a utilitarian perspective, it might be a good idea, it might be an acceptable idea to harvest people's body parts so that more people can live. The common example is what would happen if we made that decision more generally, not just to prisoners, but let's say somebody goes to the doctor and they have some blood tests done and they're just getting a regular checkup, and it turns out that they are a match for some sort of donor that needs, somebody who needs donated organs, or 10 people who need donated organs. And the argument that critics of utilitarianism make is that if Mary is a potential donor of 10 organs, then 10 people will be better off if we kill Mary. And that just seems fundamentally wrong, that we would sacrifice people's fundamental liberties to make more people happy. Maybe there's something wrong with that. So this is the typical kind of conundrum that people who criticize utilitarianism come up with. Is should we harvest organs from people who go to the doctor? It may seem like utilitarianism doesn't have an answer to this, and their answer maybe isn't quite as good as people would want it to be, but they do have an answer. So utilitarians would argue that that critics of utilitarianism oftentimes miss really important key negative consequences when they focus only on how much happiness can be brought to people based on one idea. So for example, in the example that was given about harvesting people's organs when they go to the doctor, if people going to the doctor can't be sure they won't be cut up and sacrificed to the greater good, people would stop going to the doctor. And people would be afraid to leave their homes because they would be afraid that their lives would be sacrificed in the interest of more people's lives. And so Mill and other utilitarians would argue that you can't just discount that as if it's not part of the calculus. So those are utilitarian. What Mill does is he takes his utilitarian political philosophy, and in this book called On Liberty, he uses utilitarianism as a framework for making a pretty impassioned plea for the value, the utilitarian value, the utility of liberty. Not because he thinks that people have natural rights, and in fact, in the chapter that I asked you to read, he makes it very clear that he doesn't believe in social contract theory. He doesn't say that people who have natural rights come together to form a society to protect those rights. He argues that society exists to accomplish things that people can't accomplish on their own, but it's not some sort of social contract that somebody like Locke would talk about. So part of what On Liberty does is it serves as a basis for what we would call in modern times sort of libertarian political thought. Basically, there should be a very limited role that the government plays in controlling people's behavior. He's not necessarily a libertarian, but a lot of his ideas really resonate with people who call themselves utilitarians. So Mill argues that there are sort of two kinds of liberty and two kinds of authority that could be enforced on people. The first is what we are mostly concerned about as political scientists, is what we call civil liberty. What kinds of things should the government be allowed to regulate? What kinds of behaviors should the government be allowed to legislate? And Mill argues for the maximum amount of freedom from any kind of oppression by the government. So he argues for a lot of limited government in terms of the government's role in controlling people's behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't think the government should have a role in providing social services or funding things or something like that. But he makes the argument in On Liberty that the individual person should be not subject to a lot of restriction by the government. He also talks a lot in On Liberty about what we call social liberty. And this is the idea that even if a behavior isn't something that most people would argue should be legislated against, society sometimes disapproves mightily of some kinds of behavior. And Mill challenges us in On Liberty to be sort of cautious about how we use the power of democracy to keep people from being overly weird, for lack of a better way of saying it. Mill thinks that democracy as a political philosophy, or as a way of structuring a government, it's fine in the sense that Republican forms of government or democratic forms of government where people have a right to participate in the decisions that are made about who governs them are perfectly fine. He doesn't argue against democratic forms of government or against Republican forms of government, but he does alert us to a possible negative consequence of democracy, and that is that it tends to promote mediocrity, that the average person or the average perspective on stuff is pretty middle of the road. It's pretty boring in some ways. The kinds of music that the most people tend to want to listen to maybe isn't as pushing of the envelope, maybe doesn't make society progress in terms of exposing people to new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. And so Mill argues that there's a certain amount of value to accepting eccentricity, accepting sort of weirdness, and letting people explore lots of different ways of organizing their lives in ways that maximize their individual liberty. And that while it might be appropriate sometimes for society to frown upon certain kinds of behavior, society really ought to take a step back and kind of let people be weird in that sense, what we would consider weird. Mill actually argues that there are three areas of humanity that should be respected as things that the government should be not really allowed to infringe on. And I want to talk about all three of them. Hopefully you can stop this video whenever you want and then come back to it. It's starting to get a little bit long. So the regions of human liberty are thought and conscience, so religious belief and ideological beliefs, political ideologies, etc. Tastes and pursuits, what kinds of clothes you want to wear, what kind of music you want to listen to, what kinds of hobbies you want to have, and association, who you want to marry, who you want to develop relationships with, who you want to hang out with. That basically, Mill argues that with very few exceptions, like maybe you do have laws against things like organized crime and that kind of stuff. And if your tastes and pursuits include things that harm other people, then the government can step in. But generally speaking, the government should be very hesitant. Society should be very hesitant to allow the government to regulate these regions of human liberty. Not completely, but for the most part. So liberty of thought and expression. There's a chapter 2 in On Liberty, which I did not ask you to read. Well, I asked you to read it, but I didn't ask you to write any discussion questions on it, which deals with censorship. And Mill makes a pretty impassioned plea against censorship. He says, something that we want to censor, something that we want to ban, a book or a piece of music or a speech that somebody wants to give or something. The object of censorship is either one of three things. It's either true, in which case we shouldn't censor it because society can't progress if we can't learn new truths. It might be false, and he's going to argue that it still shouldn't be censored, or it might be partly true and partly false. Mill comes out against censorship in all three cases. He said censorship is bad for individuals and bad for society in each case. Censorship is more likely to lead to bad outcomes than to good outcomes. And this one, what if something is patently false? What if somebody is promoting a conspiracy theory that is absolutely untrue or potentially even harmful, right? Why shouldn't we be able to censor that in the interest of public safety? That there's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't censor things that might indeed be false. First is that if we determine that something is, there are some things that we can know without really much argument by 99.9999% of the population are false. Something like 2 + 2 does not equal 5. It just doesn't. It just doesn't equal 5. Most people would agree with that. And the question is, what kind of harm comes from letting people claim that the earth is flat or whatever. But there might be some things where we are assuming that something is false. We are collectively, the majority has decided that something is false, when maybe it's just a matter of opinion. And so then what we're doing is we're imposing our truth on something that we're saying that it's false when it may in fact not be false. So Mill says we shouldn't censor things that we believe that we know to be false anyway. People can't be convinced of their errors if those errors aren't discussed. So the classic example that I would give of this would be people who deny that the Holocaust happened. Now, historically, we know that the Holocaust happened. We know that the moon landing happened. We know that the Sandy Hook shooting happened. We know this. Rational people are not in denial about this. Rational people recognize that these things happened. But Mill argues that if you pass a law that says you're not allowed to deny the moon landing, or you're not allowed to say that the Holocaust didn't happen, then basically what you're saying is we're not going to tolerate any kind of discussion that, even if it might lead to people changing their minds and learning something and saying, oh my God, I've always been taught because my parents were weird that the Holocaust didn't happen, but now I see that it actually did. Thank you for enlightening me. We can't have that if you're going to be censoring people. The idea, and this mostly deals with ideas that we believe are false because we think that they're dangerous. So something that most people would recognize as false would be something that promotes white supremacy or something like that, an idea that one race is superior to the other. Now, most people would agree that those claims are false. We have lots of evidence to suggest that those claims are false. And it's tempting, Mill says, to protect people, people of color maybe, or women, or any group that doesn't have as much political power as other people do. We might be thinking that we're protecting those groups if we forbid others from questioning their inferiority or something like that, or promoting issues of white supremacy, for example, or something like that. Mill argues that as tempting as that might be, we still shouldn't do it, because when we try to suppress ideas that we think are dangerous, or that we think are wrong, or that we think are harmful, they don't go away. They just fester, and they go underground, or they go onto the fringes of society where people can plot and plan and bemoan the fact that they're not allowed to say what they want to say. And then you get anger, and you get dangerous situations arising out of that. So Mill says we probably shouldn't do that. He also argues that if we believe that something is false, if we believe that our truth is the actual truth, we should allow our truth to be challenged by people who are really good at it, because then it forces us to be really good at defending our truth. And when we don't take our most cherished beliefs out and subject them to the highest levels of criticism, they become what Mill calls dead dogma. We forget why we believed that in the first place, and we just lose the ability to defend it. So if you believe in self-governance, for example, or if you believe that your religion is the true religion, and you refuse to allow other people to question, well, maybe democracy, we could have a different kind of government than self-government. Maybe dictatorship is better. If you don't allow people to say, here's why I think dictatorships are better than democracies, then you will lose the ability to promote democracy. And then when push comes to shove, you may lose democracy. That's Mill's argument. Don't allow your beliefs to become dead dogma. Mill also makes an argument that free speech shouldn't be reserved just for civil speech. And this happens all the time in society, where people want to say, well, you have a right to free speech, but you should be nice to people. You shouldn't say mean things about people. You shouldn't call people names. You shouldn't be marching in the streets and blocking traffic and holding up icky signs that nobody wants to see. Mill says you shouldn't tell people how to protest. I mean, obviously, if they're going to hurt other people or those, there might need to be some sorts of restrictions. But Mill argues that it's very easy for the majority, who never have their speech censored, to label speech they don't like as uncivil and to dismiss the message by picking on the way people choose to express themselves. And what Mill says is that this is disadvantageous for society in a lot of ways. One, if you let the majority decide what is civil and what is uncivil, then minority voices will always be suppressed. And then it's just tyranny of the majority. And Mill points out that for some groups, the only way they can be heard is to scream and be loud. And obviously, the government might want to draw the line at allowing people to engage in actions that endanger other people. But just the expression of the ideas, Mill says, we shouldn't just be dismissing or censoring people because they're not being nice enough. They're not being civil in that sense. So when is it okay to restrict liberty? So Mill argues that the only time it is acceptable for the government to restrict liberty is to prevent harm to others. And Mill argues that he's talking about actual harm. He makes a distinction between what he calls self-concerning behaviors and other concerning behaviors. And the government's authority should end at regulating other concerning activities. If something is merely self-concerning, if it only affects the person or people engaging in that behavior, then it's not within the realm of civil authority. Regardless of how distasteful people might find the behavior, regardless of how offensive people might find the behavior, if it doesn't cause some actual harm to actual people, the government should not be allowed to regulate it. And he says actual harm means actual harm, not offense. Everybody's offended by something. I'm offended by people who say that cats are just as good a pets as dogs. I find that very offensive. I don't. I'm just making something up. Some people, Mill says, some people are horribly offended by anybody who would engage in a religious practice that they don't support, or who would promote a religious religion that they find offensive, religious practices that they find offensive. Or somebody might be really offended by people who eat certain kinds of foods, or who don't exercise, or who drink too much, or who smoke marijuana or something like that. Mill says, you don't have a right to not be offended by things that other people do. It doesn't harm you from the Mill sense if somebody does something that offends you. And Mill says that a lot of times what the majority actually does want to do is punish people for doing things that they find offensive, even though those things aren't actually harmful. So that would include things like what kind of clothing people wear, what kinds of foods they eat, how many piercings you have, where you put tattoos on your body, how much you drink, what kind of drugs you do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those, Mill says, are self-concerning behaviors, not other concerning behaviors. He extends this into the realms of association that include things like who you marry. So Mill actually makes an argument in chapter 4 that laws against things like polygamy, or certainly he would probably argue, although it wasn't as big an issue at the time, any laws that restrict who a consenting adult can marry would be something that would be outside the realm of civil authority. So he would probably support same-sex marriage. He certainly supports polygamy as long as all of the people involved in the polygamous relationship are rational, consenting adults. He says we shouldn't just be using our own moral compass to restrict other people's behaviors. And he's pretty passionate about it. And he says that the reason for this is because most of the time that leads to worse outcomes than allowing people to do what they want leads to. That there's something very valuable from a utilitarian perspective in letting people organize their lives in ways that make them happy. That there's a value to that outweighs any offense that somebody might take. at the behavior of others. So actual harm, not mere offense. He also argues that he's not talking about harm that results from legitimately one person doing something better than somebody else. So, for example, if two people apply for a job and one person gets hired and the other person doesn't get hired, the person who doesn't get hired hasn't been harmed in the sense that Mill says you could take action on. Now, if that person is not hired because of something like a racist policy or something like that, that might be a different question. But if it's a question of merit and one person succeeds because they're better at something than others, so you sew clothing for a living and somebody else sews clothing for a living and they sell more clothing than you do because people like their clothing better. Well, that doesn't mean that you've been harmed because somebody else is better at something, or that you've harmed somebody because you're better at it than they are. So if somebody owns a restaurant and they're engaging in commerce and in competition with other restaurants, a restaurant that does better, even if it means that the other restaurant closes because nobody will go there because everybody wants to go to this other restaurant, the restaurant that closes, from Mill's perspective, has not been harmed. So he's not talking about that kind of harm, economic harm that comes from competition and that kind of stuff. He's talking about actual harm that might result from somebody's behaviors. Somebody stealing something that belongs to somebody else is an actual harm, but other things might not be. Something like prostitution, for Mill, wouldn't be an actual harm as long as the prostitute and the person who's paying the prostitute are doing so from their own free will. So this is why we say Mill is kind of in favor of libertarianism. He also makes the argument in chapter 4 that society has no business compelling people through the law to do things for their own good. And this is where he talks about things like restricting how much people can drink, or punishing people for eating too much, or those kinds of things. Mill says adult people have to be allowed to decide for themselves what makes them happy, even if they decide for themselves that something makes them happy that other people don't think should make them happy. So if an adult human being, rational human being, wants to spend 12 hours of every day playing video games, it's not up to society to say you're not allowed to do that, to step in and say that's not something that you should be allowed to choose. So compelling people to act for their own good, Mill says, is bad for society, and it's bad for individual happiness. That doesn't mean that society has no power over individuals. He says, we have, generally speaking, pretty universal education at this point in time, and the education system can be geared toward promoting certain kinds of behaviors over others. So teaching kids, you have until they're 18, Mill says, you have years of teaching in the public schools and in the private schools to try to shape people's minds so that they will make choices that society finds more beneficial. So teaching kids how to, exposing children to good literature, exposing children to good music, teaching people about history and how history can guide our behavior in the future so that we don't make bad decisions. Mill says parents also have the whole time their kids are kids to say, look, it's not good for you to watch this much television, so I'm not going to let you watch this much television, and try to socialize your kids to make better choices. Mill says by the time somebody becomes an adult, society's responsibility for them sort of ends, and then you got to let them go. People can also put social pressure on others. So Mill says, if somebody chooses to make themselves obnoxious to the rest of society, if somebody chooses to live their life in a way that other people find unacceptable, society has ways of responding to that. There's nothing that says you have to be friends with people. There's nothing that says you have to hire people who don't conform to at least the basic levels of societal acceptance. Mill says you have a right to order your life and structure your life however you want. but other people are not obligated to associate with you or to let your behavior go uncommented upon. So Mill says, there's nothing wrong with a friend going to another friend and saying, look, what you're doing is really damaging yourself. I know why you didn't get that job you applied to. It's because you were a jerk in the job interview, and I know that. And so if you really want to get a good job, you need to change your behavior. You need, don't go drunk to the job interview. So those kinds of things. And Mill says, actually we've become so socially correct in our society that a lot of times we don't tell people that their behavior is causing them problems, not the person who watches the behavior, but the person who does the behavior. And so we actually allow people to do things that they might actually benefit from somebody coming up to them and saying, when you do this, that, or the other thing, everybody just turns away from you. And this is why you have no friends, because you do X, Y, and Z. He says, we do that very often. And so people don't have the opportunity to do sort of self-reflection because we're also politically correct and socially correct about that kind of stuff. Legislation can also encourage good behavior. So even if it might not be appropriate for the government to ban alcohol, for example, if we don't want people to drink too much, we could use the tax system to tax alcohol at a higher level than we tax non-alcoholic drinks. Or if we don't want people to smoke, well, we can't really ban smoking from Mill's perspective, but we could use the power of legislation to enforce the idea that society as a whole doesn't think that smoking is good for people, and that so you have a cigarette tax that raises money to educate people about the dangers of smoking and that kind of stuff. But so there are things that society can do to kind of guide people's behavior. But in the end, Mill says, it's got to be the choice of the person engaging in the behavior who makes a decision about whether they're going to stop doing something that other people don't think that they should be doing. Just to kind of wrap this up, this principle, this liberty principle, is not based on rights, that you have a right to smoke and therefore society has no business telling you can't smoke. It's based on a utility principle, the idea that society is usually better off and society tends to progress if it stays out of the personal decisions that people make about what they want to do with their lives. And that society and individual happiness is generally greater when people are allowed to do what they wish to do. This principle allows sometimes for people to be compelled to do things that benefit society. So, for example, Mill believes in jury duty and paying taxes. And he even believes in, to a certain extent, Good Samaritan laws, that if you see some harm being done, you could be required by law to provide aid to others as long as it wouldn't harm you to do so. That it's okay for sometimes for government to require that people stop a harm as well as avoid doing harm. That liberty people can be compelled to prevent evil as well as to abstain from evil, usually when doing so wouldn't cause them harm. The last thing that I want to talk about is when the government maybe can step in a little bit and kind of bring this back to how we tend to see these things in the United States. We have a thing in the United States called a standard called what we call imminent lawless action, which is the standard that's used to determine when the government can get involved in restricting people's speech or restricting people's expressive behavior. And what the standard is in the United States is what we call this imminent lawless action standard, where people are free to say what they want, to publish what they want, to engage in protest, etc., up to the point where allowing them to continue would lead to an immediate illegal behavior. So, for example, people will have a right to protest, but they don't have a right to violent protest. So it's a little bit of a fine line, but the concept of liberty uh, and the restrictions on government liberty is kind of plays out in this concept in the United States of only allowing restrictions on free speech in particular when it's necessary to stop an imminent lawless action from happening. We also have things in place in the United States and in most countries called what we call time, place, and manner restrictions, which say that generally speaking, it's better for society. And in the United States, it's a rights-based theory in that sense. But generally speaking, it's better for society for people to be allowed to engage in behaviors that matter to them. But the government can put reasonable restrictions on those behaviors to prevent harm to others. So we wouldn't allow the government to stop people from expressing their ideas, but we might say that you can't express your ideas via a loudspeaker at 2 o'clock in the morning in a residential neighborhood. That would be a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. Or you have a right to put together a protest against government policy, but you don't have a right to do so in the middle of a busy street during rush hour when people are trying to get to work or trying to get home from work and blocking traffic and that kind of thing. So reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions are oftentimes allowable as rational restrictions, but censoring the ideas or censoring the speech itself is generally, according to Mill, not such a great idea. Anyway, that's it. That's what I had to say about utilitarianism and on liberty.